We're now going into chapter 4 of Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments, and this chapter is actually titled The Case of the Contemporary Disciple. So what it might give you the impression that we're talking about is contemporary in the sense of right now, or at least right now in Kierkegaard's time, the disciple, perhaps the Christian of what he called Christendom in the mid-1800s. Or if you're thinking back to the fact that he's talking about Christ as being the person who the disciple is the disciple of, in this case, maybe what he has in mind is really those people who were immediately involved with Christ around the years, say 30 to 33, 34 AD, or those who knew him a little bit earlier or something like that. As it turns out, that's not actually in the full sense what he means. He's going to be using the contemporary disciple of the time of Christ as sort of a launching pad, but not everybody who at that time might have had the title of being a disciple would actually fit Kierkegaard's profile of what counts as discipleship in this sense. And he's beginning from a place that we've seen now several times in the course of this, the distinction between a sort of religious point of view of education and the Socratic point of view, and then other points of view of education. So let's begin at the start of this chapter. He says, "The God has thus made his appearance as teacher. For we now resume our story and has assumed the form of a servant." This is so that the God could overcome the unlikeness between the human being, the rational, reasoning human being, and the God. To send another in his place, one high in his confidence could not satisfy him, like a prophet, for example. Just as it could not satisfy the noble king to send in his stead even the most trusted man in his kingdom. He's referring back to this story about the noble king who loves a beautiful maiden, and through his love, has to enter into this relationship, this paradoxical relationship with her. So then he says, "But the God had also another reason." This is a very important point. "For between man and man, the Socratic relationship is the highest and the truest." So, very often Kierkegaard is taken as if he's just disparaging philosophy. He's saying that, Hegelianism or, Plato and Socrates' point of view is no good. Really what he's saying is, no, as a matter of fact, you can differentiate within the purely human or natural realm between levels of quality, levels of truth, and the highest that you can get to is this level of the Socratic. This is the best that has been attained, and mankind discovered it back in ancient Greece. I don't think Kierkegaard himself would have a problem with saying, yeah, you could find this in other locations as well, because the whole point about the Socratic is that it's not dependent solely on the person who is the teacher. The teacher is showing the student what is already in the student. So there's a relationship of identity between the teacher and the learner that the learner has to actually come to realize, and then thereby essentially take the place of the teacher. And this fits in very well with Plato's understanding of knowledge as being able to teach. Those who truly possess knowledge can impart that knowledge to a learner. So Kierkegaard is saying something very important here. Between man and man, the Socratic relationship is the highest and the truest. If the God had not come himself, all the relations would have remained on the Socratic level. And that wouldn't have been terrible, but something would have been lacking, something would have been missing. And remember, too, going all the way back to chapter 1 and chapter 2, from the Socratic level, it can't even be adequately conceptualized what is missing, what has been left out. So, it says, "The God-servant form was not a mere disguise, but is actual. It is not a peristatic body, but an actual body. And from the hour that in the omnipotent purpose of his omnipotent love, the God became a servant, he has, so to speak, imprisoned himself in his resolve, and is now bound to go on whether it pleases him or no." And what he's exploring here, again, I've said this a number of times, is he's doing a philosophical interpretation of theological or religious doctrines, dogmas, truths, however you want to put it. So there's something that's very important here that he's talking about, though. He says, "Well, the God will not be able to send anyone in his place. He can indeed send someone before him to arouse the learner's attention. The God's presence is not accidental in relation to his teaching, but essential. The God's presence in human form, I in the humble form of a servant, is itself the teaching." So that's something very important to linger over. It's not just the teacher coming and then imparting some sort of doctrine to the student, or, in the Socratic way, getting the student to realize that he has the doctrine in him and he's really, identical to the teacher or anything like that. It is the very significant act of coming and taking the form of weakness, of vulnerability, of servitude on the part of the teacher, the reaching out to the disciple. This is what it means for the person to actually encounter love. God has been conceptualized in many different ways. One of the things that is striking about the Gospels, particularly the Gospel of John, is this notion that God is, in fact, you might say, love incarnate. There we're also sort of bringing in letters of John as well. But now notice, this is not scripture dependent. He's trying to develop this out of thinking out this problematic. So he says, God did not assume the form of a servant to make a mockery of men. So he doesn't pass through the world in such a manner that no single human being becomes aware of his presence. He will therefore give some sort of sign, though every understanding resting upon accommodation is essentially without value for one who does not receive the condition. And Kierkegaard's going to use this word condition a number of different times, and we're going to have to figure out what that actually means. You notice I don't have that on this chart. That's going to be something that's taking place in between, and we'll see what it actually is. He says, such a sign when given is as capable of repelling the learner as of drawing him nearer. So it's not something that human reason would say, oh yeah, there you go, now I understand everything, perfect, just what I wanted. And here's a good spot to linger for just a moment. When you think about the debates that people get into about religion, quite often people who are on the side saying, religion is all bunk, and, God is a figment of your imagination, or any of those sorts of things, will frequently say things like, just give me something that would absolutely convince me. And a lot of times religious people fall into the trap of thinking, I've got a great knockdown, drag-out argument that's going to be irrefutable for them. Well, somebody like Kierkegaard would say, that's not going to work. That's not the way things actually took place. And in fact, if the learner or the disciple is in error, and if their error is the very first thing, like we saw in the last couple chapters, that the teacher teaches the disciple the fact of their own error, then it's not going to be the case that you could come up with some sort of argument that would convince everybody necessarily, that would compel them. Rather, you can provide signs, and signs require interpretation. So let's skip on ahead a little bit. So I'm actually skipping over quite a bit of material where Kierkegaard is making some comparisons between love and the relationship between the teacher and the disciple. He says, the question is whether a human being may venture to express the same idea, that God would be sort of like a footloose wanderer just seeking the love of the disciple, for otherwise the God has not realized the essential elements of a human life. We answer in the affirmative. A man may so venture if he has the needed strength. He can so lose himself in the service of the Spirit that it never occurs to him to take care for meat and drink. If he is certain that want will not distract him, that distress will not confound for him the structure of his life. and teach him to rue that he did not master the first simple things before he presumed to understand more. Then he may indeed venture, and his greatness will be more glorious than the serene security of the lilies of the field. So what he's addressing here is, well, why didn't God just show up as like every man and get married and have children, and then say, oh yeah, I totally understand the human condition. There's still a relationship of unlikeness to a certain extent between the teacher showing up in historical Christianity and some of the learners. Now he starts saying some pretty funny things here. And he says, this lofty absorption in his mission will of itself suffice to attract the attention of the multitude. And, what happens? Well, with spiritual teachers, they do attract a multitude. People come to them. And now the question is, this is the question that Kierkegaard is going to be asking, are those people all disciples in the same way? Are they all in this relationship that we sort of sketched out here, which is you might say, ontological or metaphysical relationship, as well as being, one between persons? So he says, the latter, meaning the multitude, will in all probability come from the humbler walks of life, for the wise and the learned will presumably wish to propose captious questions to the teacher, invite him to colloquia, or subject him to an examination upon which they will assure him a permanent position and a secure livelihood. And, this makes sense. The ordinary people, when something new comes on the scene, they don't stand on ceremony and they come out, oh wait, what is this? What is this? And they tend to get pretty excited. Their excitement can, wane and wax rather unpredictably. The more learned people, the people who have a stake, the people who have prestige, the people who have established positions, they come out and they try to frame things in terms of those established positions. So if something new comes on the scene, they have to, or even if it's Socrates coming on the scene, they have to figure out, well, where do you fit in relation to me and what I'm used to thinking in terms of. So he says, let us now picture the God going about in the city of his appearance. To make his teaching known as the sole necessity of his life, it is his meat and drink. Teaching is his labor, and caring for the learner is his rest from labor. Beautiful expression there. Teaching is his labor, and caring for the learner is his rest from labor. He has no friends or kindred, but the learner is his brother and sister. So there's this relationship that's established there. That's a intimate, familiar, and yet social relationship. It may readily be understood that a web of rumor will soon be woven, catching the curious multitude in its snare. Wherever the teacher appears, the crowd gathers, curious to see, curious to hear, eager to tell others that they have seen and heard him. Now, Kierkegaard asks at this point, is this curious multitude the learner? Is this curious multitude in this relationship? He says, by no means. So it's not just associating oneself with this religious figure that makes a person the learner, or places oneself in, according to Kierkegaard, the relationship of faith. He says, what if one of the authorized teachers of this city sought him out secretly? And you think about, some of the scribes and Pharisees and even Nicodemus coming in the middle of the night, right? In order to try his strength with him in argument, is he the learner? He might have a better claim to being called the learner, no? He says, by no means. If this teacher or that multitude learn anything, here's a brilliant thing. If this teacher or this multitude learn anything, it's taking place in a Socratic sense. So something that appears on the surface religious is not really religious. And you get the idea that Kierkegaard would be quite willing to say that what was going on, say, in the wisdom literature of the Bible, or what was going on in the development of the Pharisaic tradition, which leads to rabbinical Judaism, is really in many ways something that's more Socratic than religious in the sense that Kierkegaard is exploring. Now that's something that we don't have the time to really go into any detail about here, but it's worth meditating upon. How much of the time are we confused by seeing some religious, exterior and saying, oh, the relationship that these people have must be religious, it must be a matter of faith, when perhaps really the relationship is a Socratic one. And remember, a Socratic relationship is not bad by itself, it's just not this. It's the best that man to man, human being to human being, rational, practical reasoner to practical reasoner can work out together in community. So he says, the god's appearance has now become the news of the day in the marketplace, in the homes of the people, in the council chamber, and the ruler's palace. It gives occasion for much foolish and idle talk, perhaps also for some earnest reflection. But for the learner, the news of the day is not an occasion for something else, not even an occasion for the acquirement of the Socratic simplicity of a deeper and fuller self-knowledge. For the learner, it is the eternal, the beginning of eternity. Both the Socratic and the religious are focused on the eternal. And that's something really important from an existential point of view. At least Kierkegaard's version of existentialism is not simply losing oneself in the everyday, in the shifting mundane details, even though they do exist. It's not what he calls historical existence, right? That has all of the importance or ontological density and depth within itself. It's the eternal. And the historical matters insofar, at least as far as the religious is concerned, in that the eternal and the historical come into confluence with each other. It's not the historical by itself that, for a Kierkegaardian existentialist, has ontological importance. It's how the eternal enters in. And these are two different relationships to and in the eternal. So he says, the God himself gives this condition, the condition of the moment. The moment is really decisive for eternity. Unless the God grant the condition which makes it possible to understand this, how can it be supposed that the learner will be able to discover it? But that the God himself gives this condition has been shown above to be a consequence of the moment. If you accept that the moment has taken place, that something has happened where eternity and time meet together and flood each other, rupture into each other, then, you can derive philosophically, and that's what he's done in the previous chapters, that you have to have this sort of structure of the teacher in relation to the disciple. The teacher is God and the paradox. The disciple is the human, rational person who is also in error. And remember, we talked about the possibility of an understanding. If it's an unhappy understanding, then it's offense. That's what we talked about in the last video installment of this. But if it's a happy understanding, that is the happy passion of what we call faith. And Kierkegaard is going to tell us quite a bit about this. So he says, here at the outset, let us take care to make it clear that the question of a historical point of departure arises even for a contemporary disciple. For if we're not careful here, we'll meet with an insuperable difficulty later when we come to deal with the case of the disciple, who we call the disciple at second hand. That's in chapter 5, which is coming up a little bit later. The contemporary disciple, the disciple who's there with the teacher, gets an historical point of departure for his eternal consciousness as well as any other later disciple. For he is contemporary with precisely that historical phenomenon which refuses to be reduced to a moment of merely occasional significance, but proposes to interest him in another sense than the merely historical, presenting itself to him as a condition for his eternal happiness. So, what is Kierkegaard talking about here? Again, the analogy, he's not making this analogy here, but the analogy to love may be quite useful. There are moments in time, Not moments, like seconds, minutes, that sort of thing. There are times, let's say, where the environment that we're in, the context, what Kierkegaard is calling the historical, the ontical, what it is that we're engaged with, that we perceive, that engages us, where we feel like there's a greater significance. Not just a greater significance like this coffee is better than other coffee, greater in that sense, but greater in a whole different scale. And it might be, silly to like do the ascending thing. Maybe it has to do with depth, or fullness, or richness, or complexity. We sense, for instance, when you fall in love with somebody, and you're just dying to know about them and understand them, and you're spending all this time together, the world appears to you in a different way, the details of your life. Think about a kiss, for example. When a kiss, this touching of lips, and perhaps some other things as well, can have so much significance that you would write a poem about it afterwards just to try to capture some of what went into it in the anticipation and in the after effect and all of this sort of stuff, the confusion it breeds in your soul, all those sorts of things. If that takes place, and perhaps for sort of some people it never has, compare that against a peck on the cheek to somebody, that you give in greeting. They're like worlds apart, right? That's what Kierkegaard is talking about here. The disciple perceives in this historical milieu, this historical moment, not just something that transcends in importance in a sort of quantifiable way, or even just in terms of levels of quality, but in an absolute way, the other historical things that they're engaged with. So he says, here we go. It proposes to interest him in another sense than the merely historical, presenting itself to him as a condition for his eternal happiness. If this is not so, the teacher is not the God, but only a Socrates. And if he does not conduct himself like a Socrates, he's not even a Socrates. But how does the learner come to realize an understanding with this paradox? How does this take place? We do not ask that he understand the paradox, but only that this is the paradox. It comes to pass when reason and the paradox encounter each other happily in the decisive moment, when the reason, where we go, reason sets itself aside. Remember last discussion that we had? Reason sets itself aside. That doesn't mean that it destroys itself, that it says, okay, I'm no longer going to think or anything like that, but it says, there's something greater than me. I need to learn from this. And the paradox bestows itself as a gift that reason cannot master, compel, necessitate. It does give itself, though, and its gift is fruitful. So he says, the third entity in which this union is realized, for it's not realized in the reason because it's set aside, and it's not realized in the paradox which bestows itself. It is realized in something. The third thing is faith. He says, this is the happy passion to which we will now assign a name, though it is not the name so much that matters. We will call this passion faith. This then must be the condition of this must be the condition of which we have spoken, which the paradox contributes. So, although I haven't put this on here yet, the paradox in bestowing itself to reason is in fact bestowing faith upon the disciple. A faith, and here we have to ask a question that Kierkegaard is really not answering for us, but I think is very important. How does that faith exist with reason? Does it exist in sort of juxtaposition to it? So here reason ends, here faith begins, and vice versa? Or do they suffuse and infuse each other? Are they completely distinct from each other? Do they modify each other? Do they affect each other within the believer in any way? Those are worth considering. So he says, let us not forget that if the paradox does not grant this condition, the only way you could get it, the learner would have to be in possession of it. But if the learner is in possession of this condition, he already is the truth, and the moment is merely the moment of occasion. Then we have the Socratic relation. So, like he says, the contemporary learner finds it easy enough to acquire adequate historical information. Why? Because they're Johnny on the spot. They're on the ground. They know about this teacher. Let us not forget that with respect to the teacher's birth, he will be in the same position as the disciple at second hand. So somebody in 100 AD or 200 AD or, in the third millennium or whenever you want. If we wish to urge absolute historical precision, there will only be one human being who is fully informed, namely the woman of whom he permitted himself to be born. So the contemporary disciple is placed in a kind of interesting position. And he says, let's imagine some people. Imagine a contemporary who reduced his hours of sleep to a minimum. So he's like, the electric eye following this guy around all the time. So that he might follow this teacher about, attending him more closely than the pilot fish, the shark. Suppose him to keep 100 spies in his service to watch over the teacher everywhere, conferring with them every evening in order to obtain a description of the teacher's movements, exact to the minutest detail, accounting for what he'd said, where he'd been each hour of the day, because his zeal led him to attach importance to the least trifle. Would such a contemporary be the disciple? And again, Kierkegaard says, by no means. That's not what this consists in. It's not knowing everything about the teacher, even though the teacher is part of what is being taught, knowing all these details that consists in discipleship or faith. He says, suppose another contemporary who concerned himself solely with the doctrine which this teacher was wont on occasion to expound. If every word of instruction that fell from his lips seemed more important to him than his daily bread, if he kept 100 assistants watching for every syllable so that nothing should be lost, if he conferred with them carefully each evening in order to obtain a presentation of the doctrine that should have the highest possible reliability, would he, on this account, be the disciple? He's talking about a lot of theologians there, isn't he? And Kierkegaard says, by no means. That's not what it means to actually be the disciple either. It's not to memorize chapter and verse. It's not to be able to roll the things out like that. There's something else that's involved. So he says, suppose a contemporary had been living abroad, returned at a time when the teacher had only a day or two to live. If engagements had prevented him from going to see the teacher, so he was brought into touch with him only at the last moment when he was about to yield his spirit, would this historical ignorance prevent him from becoming the disciple? Provided the moment became for him decisive for eternity. And he says, let's compare this guy to the other two cases that we've looked at. For the first contemporary, the life of the teacher was merely an historical event. He's not treating him as the teacher, not in the sense that we're talking about here. For the second, the teacher served as an occasion by which he came to an understanding of himself, and he will be able to forget the teacher. Just like if you actually understand everything that Socrates has to teach you, you can forget Socrates or Plato, or, and you can just have it in yourself. And Socrates would say, good for you, right? As over against an eternal understanding of oneself, any knowledge about the teacher becomes accidental and historical only, a mere matter of memory. As long as, Kierkegaard says, the eternal and the historical are external to each other, the historical is merely an occasion. What about this other guy? He is the contemporary disciple. So he says, if the entire situation is non-Socratic, that is, the teacher is giving something more than Socrates could give to the student. Because remember, Socrates says, I can't actually give you anything. All I can do is remove obstacles from your way. I can provoke you. The disciple will owe all to the teacher, which is quite impossible in relation to Socrates. This relationship of owing all to the teacher cannot be expressed in terms of romancing and trumpeting, but only in that happy passion we call faith, whose object is the paradox. So faith for Kierkegaard involves a consciousness of owing all, including understanding of one's error, perhaps even realizing that the reason that one has, as well as the faith that one has, is actually being bestowed upon one from the teacher as well. So he says, the paradox unites the contradictories and is the historical made eternal and the eternal made historical. Everyone who understands the paradox differently may keep the honor of having explained it. So, he's saying, if you want to understand the paradox differently, that's fine. I'm going to explain it this way. So he says, it's easy to see, though it scarcely needs to be pointed out, since it's involved in the fact that the reason is set aside, faith is not a form of knowledge, Kierkegaard says. For all knowledge is either knowledge of the eternal, excluding the temporal and historical is indifferent, which is the Socratic relation, learn the forms, learn what you have in common with everybody else, or it is pure historical knowledge, things of, the contingent. Caesar crossed the Rubicon at this place, or didn't do that, or this movie is playing right now, or I am 6'3", or, things along those lines. He says that's what knowledge is. No knowledge can have for its object the absurdity that eternity is the historical. So Kierkegaard is saying that faith is not a form of knowledge, and in a sense it is beyond, or it transcends knowledge. Does that mean that now rational thought is completely gone? Well, if it did, then I don't think he'd be writing anymore, would he? So he says, what else can we say about faith? The object of faith is not the teaching. And he probably should say here, not the teaching alone, because the teaching does play some role, right? But let's go with this. So he says, the object of faith is not the teaching, but the teacher. That's what faith is connecting one to. The teacher, the person. It's a personal relation. So faith can't merely be a substitute for knowledge. It can't be I'm going to believe in things even though they're completely crazy and I have no basis for believing in them, but I'm going to make myself do it. He says that's not the way it works. And he also goes on to clarify as well. He says, faith is not an act of will. For all human volition has its capacity within the scope of an underlying condition. If I have the courage to will the understanding, I'm able to understand the Socratic principle. I'm able to, say, learn the Plato's doctrine or something along those lines, to learn what's within myself. But if I don't have the condition, if that's not coming from me, and has to be given to me from something else, all my willing is of no avail. So, again, we have a condition where faith is something that is actually a gift coming from the teacher to the disciple and allowing the disciple to be in what you might call the productive, happy, proper relationship to the teacher. So, let's go on from here. He says, the teacher dies eventually. Now that he's dead, what will the learner who had been his contemporary do? Maybe he sketched some portraits of him. He may even have in his possession an entire series of such portraits, depicting and accurately reflecting every change that by reason of age or state of mind might have taken place in the outward appearance of the teacher. Is that person a disciple? He says, no, he's not, by no means. That's not what it means to understand the teacher. So he says, how does the learner then become a believer or disciple? When the reason is set aside and he receives the condition, when does he receive this condition? In the moment. What does this condition condition? The understanding of the eternal. But such a condition must be an eternal condition, if it's an understanding of the eternal, right? He receives accordingly the eternal condition in the moment. So again, eternity and time interpenetrate one another. And he is aware that he has so received it, for otherwise he merely comes to himself in the consciousness that he had it from eternity, which is the Socratic point of view. It is in the moment that he receives it, and from the teacher himself. All romancing and trumpeting abroad about one's cleverness in penetrating the gods incognito, though without receiving the condition from the teacher that one took notice of him, Kierkegaard says that's all BS. This is what he calls silly twaddle, by which one does not become a disciple but only makes a mockery of God. The servant figure was not a disguise. And when he says, in the strength of his omnipotent resolve, which is like his love, the God makes himself the equal of the humblest. Let no innkeeper or professor of philosophy imagine he's a shrewd enough fellow to detect anything unless God gives the condition for being able to detect this. Now, what does that mean? Again, let's think about this for a moment. Reason was set aside so that faith could enter in. Does that mean that reason is now like set aside forever? No. That means that reason has a role to play in here. This is something that Kierkegaard has not, I think, adequately sketched out, in part because he was reacting so strongly against the rationalism of his day, which thought that the learner could, by virtue of using their reason to sort of, attain to this. Hegel would be an example of that, but some others would as well. So, let's go on from here. He says, the disciple knows that he would have seen nothing without the condition. Why? Because the first thing he learned to understand was that he was in error. So, the first thing the disciple received was learning, I can't be the judge of everything. I actually need to receive something because I am impoverished when it comes to that. So he says, in that case, is not faith as paradoxical as the paradox? That's important. Again, in philosophy of religion, very often people want to, and also actually a lot of people in theology, they want to have a definition of faith. They want to nail faith down. A lot of religious people do too. They'll say, they'll quote this passage by Paul, and say, well, there you go, that's faith. Or they'll, quote something from Schleiermacher, or something from Tillich, or something from, whoever the flavor of the month is as far as theology goes. And Kierkegaard is saying, hey, that's not going to cut it. That's not going to work. Any formula in which you're going to try to compress and channel in and exhaust faith is actually going to lose sense of what faith is. Because faith is the relationship to the paradox, and it becomes, through that, paradoxical. That means that, ironically, faith is supposed to be belief, right? It goes against ordinary belief, so it requires a transformation of belief. So it says, faith itself is a miracle. All that holds true of the paradox also holds true of faith. Within the framework of this miracle, everything is again Socratic, yet so that the miracle is never canceled. The miracle, namely, that the eternal condition is given in time. Everything is Socratic. The relationship between one contemporary and another, insofar as both are believers, is entirely Socratic. They can learn from each other now, right? He's talking about a community of believers at this point. The one owes the other nothing. But both owe everything to the God. So what is this doing? This is encompassing the Socratic relation into this. Reason is not set aside. You still need that in order to engage with other believers. The trouble will come in when things just evolve to this level and faith gets taken out of the picture. So, now this is really interesting. Again, he brings in a interlocutor, and the interlocutor says, then it seems the contemporary derives absolutely no advantage from his contemporaneity. And yet if we assume that what you've assumed about God's appearance among men, it lies so near at hand that the contemporary generation is blessed because it's so unheard. And Kierkegaard says, yeah, that's it. The contemporary disciple, meaning the contemporary at that given point in time when there is some sort of, divine manifestation, God becoming human, they're no better off than the disciple 2,000 years later, as far as all of this goes. Kierkegaard says, yes, that's exactly it. So he says, if we're looking at this in terms of, for example, a festivity, he says, suppose that an emperor celebrated his marriage for an entire week with festivities, the like of which had never been seen. And he gives some description of this, right? let us assume that it all happened in the past and we had to be content with the meager and fasting report of what had taken place. Why should we not, humanly speaking, count the contemporaries happy? That is to say, the contemporaries who saw and heard and grasped with their hands. People sometimes think about religious life like this. You know, and if you think about the Gospels, for example, think about how little is actually chronicled in those Gospels. Even of the period of ministry, you know, roughly 3-year period. How few accounts are actually given. How much telescoping there is. You know, this is kind of a side note, but this will bring a lot of things home. I remember, and it's now almost, it's about 10 years, I think, since The Passion of the Christ came out, Mel Gibson's movie, where a lot of people got quite upset because, you know, these scenes where the scourging and the torturing is going on those are pretty horrific. And I remember, you know, people saying, "Wow, you know, I never really got it that he endured so much." And then other people were, you know, saying, they shouldn't be showing that sort of thing. And my reaction was, you know, well, when you read the Gospels, what the hell did you think it meant when they said, "and then they scourged him"? What do you think scourgings were like? But the only reason I knew that was because, you know, I know some historical things because I do a lot of, you know, historical work. So I know that people were, you know, quite brutal, and that punishments were, you know, they went on for a while and they didn't let up too easy. Now, he's talking about something like that. Wouldn't it have been better to be there with, say, Christ and know exactly what was going on? Wouldn't you be better off as a disciple then? Wouldn't you know more? Wouldn't you have more resources? And he says, suppose the splendor had been of a different kind, not immediately apparent to the senses. What profit would there then be in being a contemporary, since one would not on that account necessarily be contemporary with the splendor? Notice what he says there. You can be contemporary with some events and yet not be a contemporary of those events because you're missing what's going on in them. You're missing the significance. You know, a great example of that in movie terms is this guy Forrest Gump, right? You see him just kind of wandering around. He's in these world historical moments and doesn't realize the significance of what he's involved in. Then later on is telling this story along with this, you know, box of chocolates to this lady who's sitting there listening to him, and you get the sense he still doesn't understand the significance of it. Well, a lot of people, you know, who were there present at the time of this religious teacher would be in that sort of circumstance. So, Kierkegaard says, what does it mean then to say that one can be a contemporary without being contemporary? That one may be a contemporary and through utilizing this advantage, yet not be a contemporary. What does this mean except that it's quite impossible to be an immediate contemporary of such a teacher and of such an event? So the real contemporary, he says, is not the real contemporary by virtue of immediate contemporaneity. Well, that's a tough word to say. But by virtue of something else. So it's not being in that time and place, you know, huddled up to that teacher, listening to his every word, that makes the person the contemporary disciple, that gives them the advantage, you might say. So he says, a contemporary may be, for all that, a non-contemporary. The real contemporary is not such by virtue of his immediate contemporaneity. Ergo, it must also be possible for a non-contemporary to be a contemporary by virtue of something which makes the contemporary a real contemporary. So what would that be? What would it be that could place us in close a communion, in close of an intimate personal relationship that bestows not only faith but also renews reason to the teacher now in this present moment just as much now as it did in Kierkegaard's time, just as much in Kierkegaard's time as it did in 30 AD. Well, he's going to give you the reply to that. What is that condition? That condition is faith. So he says, the immediate contemporaneity can serve only as an occasion. It can serve as an occasion for the acquirement of historical knowledge. It can serve as an occasion for the contemporary to acquire Socratic deepening of his self-knowledge. Finally, it may serve as an occasion by which the contemporary, as one who is in error, receives the condition from the God, and so beholds his glory with the eyes of faith. But such a contemporary, he says, is not in the immediate sense an eyewitness. He is contemporary as a believer in the autopsy of faith. But in this autopsy, and this is a beautiful thing that he says here, in this autopsy, every non-contemporary, in the immediate sense, everybody who is divorced from the what they call the Christ event by time, space, even language. I mean, think about it. The Gospels are written in Greek. They retain in that Greekness a slight tinge of the Aramaic that these guys are speaking a lot of the time. There's, especially Gospel of Mark, there's a few Aramaic words, but for the most part, we're distanced from it. Does that mean that we can't actually be contemporaries? He says, no. Through faith, we actually do become contemporaries. If then some member of a later generation yearns to be a contemporary in the immediate sense, through romanticism, he only proves himself a pretender. If such a man continues to romance about how splendid it is to be a contemporary, like, oh, if only I could go in a time machine and go back and, like, hear those words, or, if only I could go to Israel and, like, walk the path, or something like that, unless you actually have faith, Kierkegaard says, that's not going to do you any good. You're just accumulating historical knowledge. You're not actually bringing the historical and the eternal together. So he says, this person does not go off to meet the paradox with its awe and fear, but rather trips off like a dancing master to be on time for the emperor's nuptials. And though he gives his expedition a sacred name, preaching fellowship for others, that they join the pilgrimage in crowds, he will nonetheless scarcely discover the Holy Land, since it's not to be found on the map or on the earth. So he says, in only one respect could I be tempted to count a contemporary, in the immediate sense, more fortunate than the member of some later generation, the rest of us. If we assume that the centuries intervene between this event and the period of a succeeding generation, there will presumably have accumulated much gossip about the thing, much speculation, much foolish chatter, that the untrue and confusing rumors with which the contemporary had to contend did not prove nearly so serious an obstacle to the realization of a right relationship. And that so much the more since the echo of the centuries, like the echo in some of our churches, would not only have tended to surround faith with noisy chatter, but might even have transformed faith into chatter, which could not very well have happened in the first generation, when faith must have revealed itself in all its pristine vigor. So Kierkegaard is saying, yeah, I mean, the immediate disciples at least have one bit of advantage. There was so much less BS being chattered about this whole relationship, and about, who this God engaging as a teacher through love, through bestowing of faith, through connecting to the disciple, through actually assuming human form and walking, breathing, eating, suffering, dying. They at least could, didn't have to contend with so much chit-chat about it. But even that, I mean, there were people who were like, yeah, I think I know exactly what this guy is. He's a prophet. No, he's the Messiah in this sense. No, he's just the carpenter's son. No, and people kept doing that. Here's the bottom line, essentially, for this chapter. The contemporary disciple is not the person who is contemporary in time, but rather the person who is contemporary through this relationship, which is bestowed by God upon the learner, who finds out that he or she is actually in error, accepts that, doesn't push it away, even though it's painful, even though it's humiliating, and then takes what they need in order to also start, growing in a relationship that overcomes that error and somehow connects up reason and faith in this happy passion, this understanding between the paradox and reason, to grow their relationship with the largely unknown God. So that's where we'll leave off with this one. The next thing that we have to go into is a little interlude, and then we have chapter 5, The Disciple at Second Hand, where we're going to look at some more of these problematics. We're getting very close to the end of these philosophical fragments. So again, what we've seen is Kierkegaard, again, taking something that is coming as a gift from God through faith, but then using reason and its categories to try to make sense out of this entire relationship. So we see that Kierkegaard is not rejecting reason at all. He's actually trying to find its proper use to fully understand the human condition.